Thank you for joining me for session 12 of Explore the Bible, the study of Ephesians. The title of our lesson is Walking as Family, and the text is Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 through chapter 6, verse 4. The lesson summary is believers are to demonstrate God's love in family relationships. The way I started the Sunday school lesson is I asked the class what's one simple action they would recommend to any family that would strengthen family bonds. And I've written this on the board so they can kind of be preparing for that when I do start the class and ask that question. One of the things that I suggest to them after having our time of discussion and their responses is there is an article by Albert Mohler, M-O-H-L-E-R. You can find it on his website, and it's about family meals. And he's reporting about a book entitled The Surprising Power of Family Meals. And it really is quite a stunning discovery that this person reports in their book about the power that the family meal has in bringing health to a child and bringing wholeness to a family. And whether you use the article or not in your class, I would encourage you to at least read the article for your own personal benefit. Many years ago, there was a family in our church that went to a family counselor that I had recommended. They were a family that was going in many different directions, and the counselor suggested that the first thing the family needed to start doing in order to begin to heal themselves was 3 times a week, schedule a time when they would have a family meal. Way back then, this counselor was wise enough to know the power of a family meal. If you've come to these verses and you're hoping to find here advice on how to improve your marriage or to improve your home life, you have too small a view of what's happening in this passage. Because what Paul is wanting us to understand in the book of Ephesians is a Christian home and a Christian marriage exist to make visible the invisible love of God. And so the world who lives in darkness is to look upon the church, and there they are to see what God intends for people when they live in unity. And then the world is to look upon Christians, and they're to see what God intends for people to live in purity. And then God intends for the world to be able to look upon a Christian family and to see what He intends loving relationships are to be like. That's the bigger picture of what's happening in this text. Now, Paul has concluded talking about spirit-filled living, and he's listed the way that it's demonstrated. It's demonstrated in a person's corporate and personal worship. It's demonstrated in a spirit of thanksgiving. It's demonstrated in a spirit of submission to one another. The phrase one another has this idea of reciprocal. Peter is to love John, and John is to love Peter. And they're to do this out of reverence for Christ. So what does this look like in the home? This is what Paul's addressing. Well, in the home, he says that when there is this submission to one another, the wife submits to the husband, the children obey the parents, and the slaves are submissive and obedient to their masters. Now, nothing that he said there is shocking or news when it came to the first century. But what Paul introduces that is different, that catches their attention, is there is this willingness to do these things, and you do it out of a sense of love and respect and a testimony for Jesus Christ. Because when you read through these verses, chapter 5, verse 22 to chapter 6, verse 4, what you see is Jesus Christ is all throughout those passages, and the people are living and relating to others out of a respect and out of a reverence for Christ. You could see this and have your class look at verse 22 of chapter 5 and chapter 5, verse 25, where husbands are to love their wives as Christ love the church. And then in chapter 6, verse 1, children are to obey their parents as unto the Lord. And in chapter 6, verse 4, fathers are to discipline their children as unto the Lord. And in chapter 6, verse 5 and verse 9, all of that is filled with this relationship to Jesus Christ. Now, with that in mind, look at the summary statement of this lesson again. And that is, believers are to demonstrate God's love. Now, you could just stop right there, because we'd all agree with that. But what Paul is saying is there are different areas of life that believers live in, and they're to demonstrate God's love. And one of those areas of life that they're to demonstrate God's love is in family relationships. And so this is what he's talking about when it comes to this instruction about the home life. Now, the first one he addresses are the wives in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 to 24. And he says in this passage to the wives, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. And I just simply ask, men, what do you think about that? And that can be a fun opportunity as well. Now, the reason given for this submission is because of headship. You might want to point out some things about the language of this passage. It says, wives, submit to your husbands, and her submission is not to every man. That's a Muslim concept. That's not a Christian concept. And it's the word submit is what is called the middle voice in the Greek language, which means it's something that she voluntarily gives to her husband. It's not something that he can demand of her. It's something she offers. But the reason Paul says that she submits to her husband as to the Lord is because of headship. Notice verse 23, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the body, he is the Savior of the body. Now, headship obviously has to do with authority. And wouldn't you agree that Jesus Christ is the authority over the church? So what's interesting is you would expect that Paul would have said in verse 23, Jesus is the Lord of the body. But that's not what he says. He says Jesus is the Savior of the body. So what is it that Paul's driving at when he points out Jesus is the Savior of the body? What did Jesus come to do when he came to save people? And what I'm wanting to lead the class to is that Jesus came to serve people, and that he also serves the body. So the definition of biblical headship is the use of power and ability for someone else's benefit. That's the way Jesus is the Savior of the body. He uses his power, his abilities for the benefit of the church. And a wife submits to a man who has been placed in that position, and he uses his abilities, his intelligence, his opportunities for the benefit of that wife. So this concept of me Tarzan, you Jane, this chauvinistic male dominance that's a caveman dweller idea, that is not what's meant by this idea of headship. A man's calling, according to this passage, is to mirror Christ in the home. He deals with her the way Christ deals with the church. And that's a good question to ask. How does Christ deal with the church? And then I say this to the class after some time of discussing that. From my perspective, in times past, men abused this authority. And I ask them, what are some examples of how men abuse the authority of headship in the home? And then I say, but I think that the problem today is not men in the home abusing the authority. I think the predominant problem today is men in the home are abandoning headship. And what would be some examples of men not taking the leadership in the home? And there's all kinds of examples. They're not taking headship and leadership in the home when it comes to disciplining their children. They're leaving that to the wife. It may be in the area of finances. Maybe it's not helping to earn the money. There's some men like that. Or maybe it's not being concerned enough to watch over the money and to prepare for its family's finances, for their future. Men have abandoned the home when it comes to establishing a vision for this family or standards for this family. And of course, there are men who have abandoned their headship when it comes to the spiritual aspects, just leading the family to pray when it comes to have a meal, saying to the family on Saturday night, get your clothes ready, we're going to church on Sunday morning. Just those simple kinds of things. I think we're living in a day in which the biggest problem with headship for men is not the abuse of that authority. It's the abandonment, and that needs to change. We are plagued with passive men. Well, this sets the context for verse 22. I want you to understand this is the background for when Paul says wives are to submit. The word submit is made up of two words, the word under and the word arrange. And so it's the idea that she arranges herself so as to be of help to this man in his leadership. Now, if you go to work for the president, you understand that you're to submit to the president, that you are there to use your intelligence and your skill and your influence to help his agenda succeed. And that means that you are, if he's wise, you can fully express everything and every gift that you have for his benefit. And we don't seem to have a problem with understanding that this is a form of submission. And this is what Paul is saying to this wife, that she is to fully express herself for the full benefit of this man. And so ultimately, submission is not about taking orders, but submission is about doing what's good for others, to act in their best interest. So here's the picture. Here's a husband that he lives to serve his wife and his family. He thinks, what's the best that I can do for them? And here's a wife who uses her substantial abilities to the fullest extent to help him to be everything God had called him to be. Now that would be a wonderful home, and that's the ideal that God is leading us to. But of course there are two problems with that. And I ask the wives, what is it that your husband is not like Jesus? There are two things your husband's not like Jesus. Well, the first is he's a sinner, and Jesus was sinless. And the second thing is Jesus never needed any counsel. He never asked the disciples, do you think we ought to go across the lake at this time? Jesus was so in tune with the Father, he knew exactly what to do at all times. Your husband's a sinner. That means he's going to make mistakes. He needs to be forgiven. He needs to be shown some grace, some mercy. And the second thing is your husband needs counsel. And God has given the wife to help the husband understand and to see some things that maybe he wouldn't see. So the first thing is wives submit. There's an actor named Danny Bonaducci. Danny was first on the scene in the TV series many years ago called The Partridge Family. He's the bright redhead boy that's in that television series. He grows up to be a man, and he's just a wild man. He's addicted to drugs. He's got a wild kind of personality. But he marries a woman, and she happens to be a Christian, and she finally gets sick of this, and she tells him, and trying to hold him responsible, the next time you go off on one of these drinking and drug sprees, when you come home, I will have sold every bit of furniture. And you're going to have to take your wild party money and buy us new furniture. And he said, that's exactly what happened. Now, when he told the story, and I heard him tell this on television, when he told the story, he wasn't telling it in a way that was angry with his wife. He was telling it in a way that he appreciated his wife because she was holding him accountable for the consequences of his decision. I would say that was a woman who was understanding her man and responding in a way to get his attention so that he would live in a way that was most responsible. Wives are to submit to their husbands as to the Lord. The next thing he addresses are the husbands. And what Paul had to say about the wives was not controversial. But what Paul has to say to the husbands was absolutely astounding in Paul's day. Now notice, this is what he says that's so controversial. Husbands, love your wives. In that day of arranged marriages, a man married a woman maybe for just simply the purpose of her rearing his children and passing on his name, or maybe he married her for some kind of financial advantage, but the concept that he would only be limited to this one woman was not really in their mind. They would have concubines, they would go to the temples, and there would be prostitutes that they would use in religious worship services, if you can imagine the depravity of that kind of day. And here Paul comes along and he says, men, when it comes to your wife, you are to love her. Well, how, Paul? He said, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. One clear word to men. He understands men. Men need clarity, and men only need singularity when it comes to understanding what to do. And he says, here's your one assignment when it comes to your marriage. Love this woman. And if you want to know how, love her like Christ loved the church. And notice, gave himself for her. Again, it comes back to this idea of service. How does a man serve his wife in marriage? And then what goes on, he says this service is going to produce a result in verse 26 through 27. And what you see here is a description of a bride getting ready for her wedding day. She's cleansing herself. She's preparing herself to make herself beautiful. It is quite a fascinating thing for a man as women get ready for weddings. I'm the father of 4 daughters, 4 married daughters, and I can tell you it is quite a process. There are appointments to get their fingernails and their toenails done. There's a process of their hair being fixed just perfectly, and someone else comes and applies makeup, though they've applied makeup all their life. And then there's that one beautiful particular dress that they wear. A woman is the most beautiful and the most perfect that she could possibly be on her wedding day. And what he's picturing here is a husband Jesus is helping the church to get perfect for that wedding day. And that is, Jesus is working in the church so that the church becomes everything God intended to be. And this is a man's way of loving a wife. How can he help her achieve her God-given purposes? Now, what men tend to do is they want women to help them achieve their purposes. So there's some men who will send their wives to work rather than staying home and raising the children, and they don't necessarily need to do that. I understand there's always circumstances. There are men who want their wives to earn an extra income so those men can do things and buy things that they want, whereas the wife may be wanting to stay home to raise children. There are men who relate to wives and they want their wives to be dependent upon them instead of their wife coming to a sense of independence. There are men who relate to their wives and they want their wives to be in such a way that it enhances their appearance and not the wife's appearance. My whole point I'm trying to drive at is, so oftentimes a man relates to his wife in the way that she serves him. And what Jesus is pointing out here is, here's how a man loves his wife. He finds ways to serve her. Now in verse 28 to 30, Jesus changes the picture to help a man understand how to love his wife. Now maybe this concept of Jesus loving the church is a little bit too abstract for him, so he just really gives men another understanding of how to love when he says in verse 28 to 30, in the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. And a man understands how he cares for his body and how he protects his body and how he nurtures and nourishes his body. Now, let me just change the picture a little bit. You know that the word husband is the root for the word husbandry. And husbandry is a word that describes people who take care of plants or cultivates plants and takes care of animals. And so here is a man, a gardener, and he has his plants, his vegetables and his flowers. He knows something about the kind of soil that those plants need in order to produce the most fruit and the most beautiful blossoms. He knows the kind of moisture they need. He knows the amount of sun they need. And if something's lacking, he'll provide it. Or if something more is needed, he will see that that's there. And so it's a picture of a gardener who understands, this is what I need to do, this is what they need in order to achieve their full potential. And that's just simply the picture of a husband. He is to relate to his wife in that kind of way. So this is a person that she can respect. Now you'll notice that it goes on to say in verse 30 to 31 that not only does he serve her, and not only does he find ways in which to meet her need out of love for her, but it says in verse 31, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one. And of course that's a reference to Genesis. But another way that a man loves his wife is he makes her priority. She is the number one in his life. And some of the problems that couples have in marriage is the father hasn't disengaged from his mother, or the wife hasn't disengaged from her father and made the number one relationship, the number one dependence and trust, their mate. And so this is just simply saying that this relationship becomes priority. And this idea of one flesh, it is the idea of a sexual union, but that is a picture of the fact that these two complement one another. They bring something to the relationship. They bring something to the person that helps the other person be more of what God intended them to be. Now there is a gift of celibacy, and in those gifts, God will provide what needs to be provided for those persons to live in that kind of relationship with others. But God's intention is for a wife to help a man grow to his full potential, and a man to grow to a woman, for her to grow to her full potential. And notice verse 32. This mystery is profound, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. He's saying it's Christ and the church that helps us understand marriage. It's not marriage that helps us understand Christ and the church. So if you want to know how to live in a marital relationship, study about Christ and his relationship to the church. And there will be principles there to help you know how to live with one another. And then verse 33, to sum up, each one of you is to love his wife as himself, and the wife is to respect her husband. So it comes down to this. She's to respect him. He's to love her. Now, in every wife, there is this desire to have a man she respects. It's in her heart. She wants to respect her husband. But there's a part of her that needs to find a man to respect, and so she will work in a way that will cause him to see he needs to live respectfully. But being a sinner, she oftentimes goes about it in the wrong way. And a man wants a woman that he can love, and he will seek to do that, but he tends to go about it in the wrong way because he's a sinner. Now, what men tend to do in trying to get a woman to love him is they will dominate her. And what a woman will do in seeking to get a man to respect her is she will diminish him. So if you ever catch yourself in a way in which you're not serving this person, but you're tending to nag, or you're tending to harp, or you're tending to force, you've just stepped into the wrong area. Because a husband that loves is a man that wants to give himself. That sounds a lot like submission to me. And a woman who submits is wanting to build this man up, not tear him down. And so the scriptures teach that this is a way in which we demonstrate God's love in the family relationship. In chapter 6, verse 1 through 3, we have instructions about the children. And basically, there are two things said here. First of all, there is an action on the part of the children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord because this is right. And then there is an attitude that they're supposed to demonstrate in their obedience, and that is to honor your father and mother. Now, he says, because this is right. Isn't that an interesting thing to add? Why would Paul add, because this is right? Because there are philosophies in this world that would oppose that. There are philosophies out there that say you shouldn't require your children to obey. That would be restrictive of their creativity. Let little Throckmorton saw the legs off the coffee table. To tell him no would be to diminish him and to discourage his creativity. I would say, take the saw away and tell Throckmorton never to do that again. And he said this is the right thing to do. And notice he says there's an attitude in which these children are to do it, and that is one with honor. It's a sense of respect in which they do. There are two different ways to carry out the trash. There are two different ways in which to make your bed. There are two different ways to take your dishes to the sink. There's a way in which is resentful, and then there's a way in which you can honor your parents. But the other thing about this is he said, so that it may go well with you in the land. Now, Proverbs says that a parent who won't discipline their child hates the child. Parents who won't make the hard decisions to discipline their children, to lead their children to obedience, are parents who are harming their children. That child is going to go out into a world, is going to work for an employer. That employer expects him to obey, and if he doesn't, he's going to be unemployed. He's going to live in a world in which he's going to try and develop friendships. And if he's so selfish and so focused upon himself that he can't relate in a way that is reciprocal, he's going to be a lonely child. In order for that child to make accomplishments in life, he has to learn some kind of discipline. And if a parent won't help that child learn discipline by obedience, then that child will never reach its potential. Do you see what the writer of Proverbs is saying? Do you see what this passage is saying? It's quoting out of the book of Exodus about living long in the land. This kind of behavior where you don't teach your children to obey, and the consequences of it, that's what you'd wish on your enemies. And so the book of Proverbs says you need you need to teach your children discipline. How can children honor parents? That might be a good question to ask. It doesn't say anything about whether the parents deserve it. It doesn't say to do everything they ask you to do, but it does say that you're to honor them and God will bless that. The last thing it finishes up is with parents in chapter 6, verse 4. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Again, there's two parts to this verse. There are guardrails. There's something they're not supposed to do. They're to live within these boundaries. Don't stir your children up to anger. He's talking about the way we parent. And then there's guidance. Bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Now, the word father is just exactly that. And obviously it would include the mother. But this is a good word for our day. Again, fathers, in my opinion, my observation, seem to have abandoned this responsibility. And the fact that he elevates fathers elevates the responsibility of parenting the children. This father's responsible to see that these children are parented. Now, this idea of stirring up, do you know that word is used in the Old Testament to talk about how the disobedience of the children stirred up the Lord in terms of his judgment upon them and their sin. And he's saying, don't act in such a way that you stir your children up in discouragement or rebellion because of the way you're acting. And so be watching the anger in your children. It's a very good sign. Children are going to have all kinds of emotions because they're children. But be very clear on this area. Are you relating to them? Are you so discouraging them that they just simply finally give up or they rebel against you? And then he says to bring them up. That is to do what's best for them. And two things, training and instruction. The training is showing them how to do it. The instruction is teaching them to do it. So it's more than just telling a child. It's showing a child how they're supposed to live. So this is how we demonstrate love in the family. Now, what I did to close the lesson is I made copies of this article from Albert Mohler's site on the family mealtime, and he's taking it from a book called The Surprising Power of Family Meals. And I gave everybody a copy of that because I just find it fascinating in terms of the power of a family meal. Really, you should read that. But what I asked them to do is, as an assignment, particularly if this is not a part of their practice, and it makes no difference if it's a nuclear family or a single parent with children, or even senior adults who are widows. Maybe they have friends they could do this with, but this week, plan a time and intentionally have a sit-down meal with your loved ones and just watch what takes place. No phones, no texting, just watch what takes place. And the things this article talks about, you'll see some of those things begin to show up. It's a wonderful message, and they need to hear it from God's Word. And thank you for giving it to them. God bless.